Welcome to another episode of MTG Cribs. This is my crib. It's filled with stacks of Magic cards, and I can't leave the basement until I sort all of them and get them posted on TCG Player. Welcome to another Brainbite. What we've done on the Brainstorm Brewery channel is we've decided to have these series of smaller videos, bite-sized if you will, called Brainbites. Oh man, there's like a Magic card called Brain... Oh, that's too good. We are too smart. What we're going to do is go really deep on a topic in MTG Finance. This week, I'm going to drill down on the topic of EDH Rec, what it is, what it's for, why I use it for EDH Finance, and if there's time, I'll make up a fourth thing. EDH Rec is a website that scrapes sites like MTG Goldfish for their EDH lists and collates them and analyzes them and posts the data. So if you wanted to ask a question like, what percentage of Estrad decks are running Plea for Guidance? Something like that. You would type Estrad into the search bar and then you would scroll down the page until you found Plea for Guidance. You saw, hey, it's in 22% of the decks. That top number means that 22% of the Estrad decks in the database contain that card. The synergy score beneath it is basically it's how often those cards are found together. So a high synergy score would mean that Plea for Guidance was basically only in Estrad decks, and a low synergy score meant it was sort of a format staple. In fact, on cards like Sol Ring and Brainstorm and stuff like that, it's actually possible to have a negative synergy score. Like, the cards are that unlikely to be found together just because it's a format staple rather than a deck staple. EDHREC is not just useful for typing in the name of a commander and finding out what cards are used in that deck. It's very useful for typing in the name of a card and seeing if it gets played at all. I had someone ask me on Twitter whether I thought Paradigm Shift was a card that could take off based on its EDH playability. And when you type Paradigm Shift into EDHREC, you see that it's played in 57 decks. Now, that number is meaningless without context. How many decks could potentially play Paradigm Shift? It couldn't go in a mono white deck, for example. So what I like to do when I give somebody the raw number of, it's in this many EDHREC decks, I like to say something else that's played about the same amount as. How about Sorrow's Path? Sorrow's Path is also in 57 decks, so I don't think Paradigm Shift is going to go up based on its EDH playability. I think its reserve list status has more to do with its desirability than anything else. EDHREC is a great deck building resource. If a player wants to build a commander, they would just type the name of that commander and they would see what other people are playing in the deck. And there's even a feature on EDHREC that can generate an average deck based on the most likely cards in each slot, like sorcery, instant, artifact, stuff like that. It'll actually put together an average list, and that list is usually pretty playable because it's based on the wisdom of crowds, right? Like, the average deck is basically crowdsourced. You know, a lot of people are playing Rishkar's Expertise in Angry Omnath because, of course, they are. A lot of people are playing the Chain Veil in Atraxa because, of course, they are. Sometimes it can end up a little bit of a mess, and you'll want to use some of the filters. There are thematic filters where you can click and say, hey, how many Atraxa decks are Planeswalker decks versus how many Atraxa decks are Infected and stuff like that. You can see the different themes, and that'll bring up different, most used cards because it's filtering out just the cards that are useful in, like Atraxa Infect, for example. As you can see, EDHREC has a lot of data, and there's sometimes a need for a little bit of context. If you want to go to the article section of EDHREC, it could become a full-time job just reading those. There are 1 or 2 new articles every single day. And on the front page, there's also community content with other, EDH content creators, streamers, YouTubers. Are YouTubers not streamers? Is that not, like, the same thing? Man, I sound old, don't I? The guy was on the Twitter and the Instagram. I don't know how to sound like an old, out-of-touch person. Want to know what's going down in EDH? It's basically the go-to place. It's got all the best community content. It's got articles written by people who are endeavoring to give a little bit of context to the data. And then if you go past all that and just type stuff in the search bar, it'll take you to the heart of EDHREC, which is the data. Now, I've been using EDHREC data for about 3 years in the articles I write for MTGprice.com. And I think it does a very good job of basically predicting the future. What I mean by predicting the future is that EDH tends to move a little bit more slowly. Players tend to register the decks that they're playing before they build them. Sometimes as soon as a card is spoiled, they will begin brewing, and they'll register those lists online just as a placeholder. But the thing is, those get scraped up by EDHREC too, so we start to get data right away. And once we start getting that data in, whether the player has committed to buying that Chain Veil or not, it's listed as, hey, you know, ever since Atraxa was spoiled, the number of Atraxa decks running the Chain Veil have gone way up. You know, I think Chain Veil could be a real expensive card, and it turns out that we were able to predict that. And we were able to predict that we would make money on Chain Veil again when they announced Planeswalkers as commanders. So sometimes, you know, a card can be a little bit obvious that you don't need to be an EDH player to predict it. I tend to call cards like that kitty cats, basically based on the fact that cards like Waiting in the Weeds spiked as soon as they announced that there was going to be a cat-based precon, even though Waiting in the Weeds doesn't really synergize with any of the cards in the actual cat deck. People didn't wait around for EDHREC data. What they did was they heard cats and they bought cats. So I use the term kitty cats, a little bit condescendingly, I'll admit, to refer to cards that are so obvious for the archetype, they might not even be in the deck, and they're going to be obvious to people who don't necessarily wait around for data or even play EDH. They hear cats, they buy cats. So you have two different examples where the Chain Veil was not as obvious when they spoiled Teferi, and we had to wait and see, oh, hey, people are using this Teferi commander with Chain Veil, you know, to make an infinite combo. I wouldn't have guessed that, not being an EDH player, but, you know, now that it's starting to show up in a bunch of lists, I guess it's obvious. Versus, well, Planeswalkers are commanders, Chain Veil's a Planeswalker card, this seems like a slam dunk. I found there's a bit of a gap between people actually buying the cards and registering the decks, as I said before. So there's a little bit of an exploitable time gap where you can say, hey, lots of people are building Eureka or starting to buy ninjas, and you know, you can get your foil and Ninja the Deep Hours before it spikes. You know, you can say, hey, I think people are going to run the Enchanted Evening combo in Estrid, and now's the time to get Enchanted Evening before that goes up. Some of your non-kitty cat cards are going to reveal themselves based on people registering a lot of the decks versus being obvious right away. Something like Crystal Chime was something that showed up after a lot of people had registered decks versus everybody knew Replenish would be a card right off the bat. I think kitty cat cards tend to spike harder because I think people have the confidence to buy in very deep, and I think the people that wait around for data, well, don't necessarily get the low-hanging fruit, which is sometimes the fattest and sweetest fruit, but nobody's fighting you. Well, you hear EDHREC cited a little bit more around finance circles, like the finance subreddits, and I think that has a lot to do with the methodology that I've sort of put forward. I think people tend to run out the raw number of decks that a card is in, and without context, that's sort of meaningless, as we said before. So, Sphere of Safety is in 14,370 decks, but what does that mean? Is that the most commonly played white card? Are there so many decks in the database that anything under 30,000 isn't played at all? So what I like to do, and this is something it probably took me longer than it should have to start doing, is I like to say, well, it's kind of sandwiched in between the cards Blind Obedience and Mother of Runes in the top 50 most played white cards. So 14,000 is quite a lot of decks. Sphere of Safety obviously shows up a ton. While those raw numbers don't really mean anything without context, how you use them in relation to each other is meaningful. Well, this is in 5 times as many decks as this, so I think the same sort of price increase is warranted. Well, this is in 10 times as many decks as that, but this other card's played in other formats. It's important to know all the factors going into it, and this is a little bit art as much as it is mostly based on science, just because we have raw numbers, which is something we don't have in a lot of other formats. Now, EDHREC is not a perfect metric. There are some websites where people put their EDH decks that the EDHREC does not scrape, and we're heavily reliant on people to submit the decks themselves, which can be a time-consuming process if you've got, like, 50 decks and you have to type all of them out if you haven't done that before. Porting stuff over from other sites is pretty easy. You just go to the Recs tab at the very top of EDHREC and just paste the deck list in there, name it, put the commander on there, and click submit. It's that easy. So even a process like that can take under a minute per deck can still get really time consuming if you have lots of decks. Especially if you're doing a lot of brewing at the start of a format, or you're trying to port your entire collection of decks over from another website. That's not something a lot of people are doing. So you could say that there are, large swaths of the EDH deck registration game that we're not scraping, and that could mean our data is invalid. But I don't think that's true, because I think that we're getting an accurate cross-section. Even if we're not getting the total number of decks out there, I think we're getting enough of a representative sample that we're not making bad financial decisions. We're not getting false positives. Now, if there's a card that's only played by competitive EDH players, I don't think there are really that many people who are just competitive EDH players that we're going to miss a ton. But if we do end up missing a card, that's not as bad as getting a false positive. That's not as bad as spending a lot of money on a card that doesn't pan out. So I think that even if we do miss some of the only competitive stuff, I think casual EDH generates more revenue. I think it moves more prices. I think there are more people involved in it. And I think you're more likely to get the casual players the way EDHREC is composed now. So if you're not getting the raw number of decks out there, I don't think that matters per se, because say we think there are 14,370 decks running Sphere Safety and is actually 1.7 million. Do we not think that Sphere Safety is a good card? Well, no, because we have a card like Sigil the Empty Throne that's in 6,000 decks. So we're like, well, that's in a little under half as many decks as Sphere of Safety. So we expect the prices to move a little bit less. You have to factor in all the other things like the number of printings and the fact that one's a rare and one's an uncommon. But after you factor all that in, you say, well, this isn't half as many decks. It doesn't matter if the real number of Sphere of Safety is 1.4 million and the real number of Sigil is 600,000. The point is the ratio is the same, and we're making our decisions based on how much we expect one card to move based on what other cards have moved, or what percentage of new decks a card is in, or things like that. So I don't think the raw number is as important as the ratio, which is why I stopped giving raw numbers as justification for a card. I don't say, well, I think Sphere of Safety is good, it's in 14,000 decks. I say, well, Sphere of Safety is the 22nd most played white card, and it's in more decks than Mother of Runes. I think a more complete picture like that is more accurate. So if you're making a persuasive case to people, give them as much information as you can based on EDHREC. And I think that will give people a more informed decision, as opposed to saying, well, Paradigm Shift is an EDH staple, which is the kind of thing that I've heard as like a sort of ex post facto justification for a card like Reparations going up that was targeted because it was on the reserve list. And people come along and say, well, Reparations, it's so good in EDH. That's probably what did this. And then you can go on EDHREC and say, well, this is how many decks are running Reparations. I think there's another factor at play here. So while EDHREC is not going to be the perfect website, it does kind of have some limitations and drawbacks. I've been using EDHREC, like I said, for 3 years to make a lot of my financial decisions. I feel like my hit rate has gone way up. And the fact that you have people that are brewing and taking, sometimes weeks or even like up to a month to buy the card they already committed to brewing with. You have a long time to pick up the stuff in preparation of the card actually going up. EDH players tend to buy one copy, where constructed players tend to buy 4 times as many. I think constructed players will never register a deck list of something they didn't play, because deck lists are registered at tournaments versus registered at their leisure like they are on EDHREC. I think for all those reasons, you have a lot more time to pick up the cards that you think are going to go up based on their inclusion on EDHREC, and I think that amount of time means you're not going to get your orders canceled. When you're watching the Pro Tour, you see something on camera on Friday, you're not going to get that card. Your order's going to get canceled on Monday. But if you're picking up, a a bunch of cleansing meditations because you think people are going to play the Enchanted Evening combo with cleansing meditation in a 2 Vasa deck, well, could be you've got a couple weeks to make those pickups. This was just a brief glimpse into what EDHREC is, why I tend to use it in my MTG financiering, and I think this will serve as a good basis for future videos about the subject. If you'd like me to drill down on a specific aspect of EDHREC, you can go ahead and leave that in the comments or message Brainstorm Brewery. I'd like to thank you for watching our video. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I'm told that affects our metrics somehow. While you're here watching on our YouTube page, if you haven't yet, could you like this video with the thumbs up icon? Could you become one of our subscribers so you can, get all of our content? And you see that little Temptress, that little bell icon over there? If you go ahead and finger blast that, you'll get a notification whenever we make a new Brainbite or Brainstorm Brewery, just regular podcast episode. Thanks so much for watching, everybody, and go ahead and leave me any comment you want, constructive or otherwise. Goodbye.